Summary of Eichmann in Jerusalem by Hannah Arendt. Eichmann in Jerusalem is an updated version of the serialist report Hannah Arendt wrote for The New Yorker in 1963. It is about the trial of Nazi official Adolf Eichmann before an Israeli court 17 years after his crimes. During his 10 years with the SS, Eichmann became a resident expert on Jewish matters. He ended up being in charge of sending millions of Jews to concentration camps in Eastern Europe, where the vast majority were killed. Even though he was detained by American forces after the war, he was able to hide his identity until he could escape and flee to Argentina. There, he lived a simple life but didn't try to hide his past until the Israeli intelligence service kidnapped him in 1960 and put him on trial the following year. Arendt says that while Eichmann's sentence of death by hanging was a fair punishment for his crimes, the court missed the central moral, political, and even legal problems raised by his trial. The prosecution, led by Israeli Attorney General Gideon Hausner, said that Eichmann was a bloodthirsty, anti-Semitic killer who was not only responsible for the final solution policy that killed 6 million Jews, but was also one of its main planners. Arendt disagrees with this story and says that it doesn't match the facts of the case, that it's used as propaganda for Israel to say that it got revenge for the Jewish people, and, most importantly, that it hides the horrifying truth, that Eichmann was not a criminal mastermind but a thoughtless, loyal bureaucrat who wanted to impress his superiors and didn't realize what he was doing, in a moral sense, not a technical one. Arendt says that Eichmann took part in horrible crimes and is responsible for them because he shut down his morality and refused to think about how his actions affected others. This was made worse by the fact that the Nazi government wanted to get rid of moral values and replace them with the value of blind loyalty. This made German law the opposite of morality. Arendt's final conclusion is that Eichmann's trial shows not only how important moral conscience and resistance to totalitarianism are, but also how important it is for the international community to come up with new criteria and processes for dealing with crimes like the Holocaust. The book starts with the words Beth Hamishpath, which means the House of Justice. Even so, the courtroom is more like a theater and the trial is more like a show put on by Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, who makes sure that the world knows about the suffering of the Jewish people, not just during the Holocaust but throughout history, and the bravery of the Israeli state. The 3 judges on the court, who are all German Jews and led by Moshe Landau, can easily see through the prosecution's hidden agendas and do their best to make sure the trial is only about justice. Arendt says in the second chapter that Eichmann's indictment, prosecution, and defense all focus on questions that seem unrelated, like whether Eichmann killed anyone himself and whether his crimes can be excused as acts of state. This is because the indictment requires him to have acted out of base motives and with full knowledge of the criminal nature of his deeds. But the psychiatrists who evaluated him thought he was normal, and his early life was boring. He failed out of multiple schools and had a boring job as a traveling salesman. He joined the Nazi Party on a whim because he wanted to start over and feel like he belonged to a group. In the 3rd chapter of her book, Arendt talks about how Eichmann became an expert on Jewish affairs in the SS, thanks in large part to his love of Zionism and his early success organizing the emigration of Jews from Vienna. But even though he thought Jews should have a place, he couldn't understand their point of view or anyone else's. He could only say the same things over and over, and he forgot almost everything that happened during the Third Reich, except for the big events in his own career. In the 4th chapter, Arendt talks about how he worked with Zionists to help Jews get to Israel safely. This gave the Nazis what they wanted, which was for there to be fewer Jews in Europe. But as more and more Jews left, other countries became less willing to take them in. Arendt then describes Eichmann's foolish attempts to create a Jewish homeland in Poland, Madagascar, and then the Czech village of Theresienstadt, which instead became a concentration camp under his command. In the 6th chapter, Arendt tells how Eichmann found out about Hitler's new plan for a final solution to the Jewish question, mass murder. The Nazis were getting more and more eager to get rid of Europe's Jews, but Eichmann's plans for resettling them were not possible. Even though Eichmann was shocked at first, especially when he saw the killing centers for himself, By 1942, he had given up on his guilt and was even more loyal to the Nazi Party than before. Arendt talks about this change in her 7th chapter. Most of it happened at the Wannsee Conference, where Eichmann worked as a secretary while the Nazi leaders made detailed plans for the killing. When Eichmann saw that none of his respected leaders had any moral problems with their plans, he put his doubts aside. So did most of Europe, including the Jewish councils that made lists of people who might be deported and helped the Nazis round them up. Arendt shows in Chapter 8 that Eichmann really thought that blind loyalty was the right thing to do. Even after Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, told him to stop carrying out the final solution, Eichmann kept doing it because he thought Hitler's word was law and refused to follow orders that went against it. Even though he had long since lost his moral conscience, the fact that he kept killing Jews was a direct result of the legal conscience he had taken on instead. After talking about Eichmann's personality and way of thinking up until the end of the war, Arendt spends the next 5 chapters talking about what happened because of what he did. She goes from one area to the next. She starts with the Reich, where the Nazis tested their transportation system and saw if other countries were willing to help save their Jews living abroad. In the parts of Europe that Germany controlled, what happened to Jews depended on how free their home countries were politically and what their national values were. Some countries, like France and Hungary, didn't mind when the Nazis deported foreign Jews, but they stopped when Eichmann tried to deport their own citizens. Other countries, like Croatia and Greece, followed the Nazis' orders and didn't care what happened to their Jewish residents. Still others, like Italy and Belgium, resisted the Nazis by making sure orders weren't followed, deportees could escape, or most Jewish residents were killed. The most terrible thing that happened was in Romania, where a very anti-Semitic government killed 300,000 Jews on their own land before Eichmann could even plan to send them to death camps. The most amazing stories came from Norway, Bulgaria, and especially Denmark, which saved almost all of its Jews through passionate protests by the general public. Arendt sees this as proof that organized moral resistance can't be defeated by totalitarianism. In fact, some Nazi leaders in these countries quit their jobs when the local people spoke out against them. This suggests that moral resistance can even show the agents of totalitarian evil the conscience that their philosophy has told them to ignore. Arendt looks at the East last on purpose to show how far away the case is from the truth. For a long time at the beginning of the trial, Hausner had many witnesses talk about what they went through in Eastern Europe, where Eichmann had no power or authority. By looking at Eastern Europe last, the judges showed that they knew it wasn't important and was just propaganda. But for some reason, they also decided that Eichmann was guilty of crimes in the East, which Arendt thinks shouldn't have had any effect on his final punishment. Arendt gives a bird's-eye view of the trial's timeline in the second-to-last chapter. Despite the prosecution's parade of irrelevant witnesses, who mostly talked about their suffering and rarely mentioned Eichmann, the defendant himself was the most important witness, and the judges learned the most by just asking him questions. But she also talks about the dramatic moment in the courtroom when one of the prosecution's witnesses talked about a German army officer named Anton Schmidt who secretly helped Jews escape from Poland until he was killed. She says, everything would be so different today if only more of these stories could have been told. She believes that resistance can never be practically useless. When it lives on in stories, it can show that tyranny is never complete, that some people will always fight against injustice, and that everyone is capable of taking the moral stand that is needed to do so. Arendt's last chapter is a summary of Eichmann's life after the war and his escape to Argentina, where he talked freely about his past and even gave an interview to a famous Dutch Nazi journalist before Israeli agents kidnapped him in 1960. In fact, this kidnapping raises a lot of legal questions, since Israel broke international law and Argentina's authority by doing it. Arendt points out that it was ironic that Argentina didn't do anything because Eichmann wasn't a citizen. Like his victims, he could be removed against his will because he didn't have a country. Then she talks about the verdict. Eichmann is guilty of crimes against the Jewish people, crimes against humanity, and being a member of criminal organizations in the Nazi Party. The prosecution's insistence that Eichmann killed with his own hands didn't matter much to the court. It explained that the Nazi regime and Holocaust were unique because responsibility was spread through a bureaucracy, and that the degree of responsibility increases as we get farther away from the man who uses the fatal instrument with his own hands. But when Eichmann appealed his case, the Israeli Supreme Court threw out Judge Landau's reasoning and agreed with the false claims of the prosecution that Eichmann was quietly at the top of the Nazi hierarchy. Eichmann's death sentence is upheld, and he is put to death soon after. Much of Arendt's most insightful and original comments is in her epilogue, which directly talks about how the Eichmann trial wasn't fair and what that means for the law and the future. Most importantly, she says that, just like at the Nuremberg trials, the Jerusalem court didn't understand what was special about crimes against humanity. She thinks of crime not as a specific harm done to a person but as a violation of the moral order of a group. For example, trying to kill off a whole group of people is a crime against human diversity and, by extension, against the whole human community. She says that the Israeli court, unfortunately, was more ready to follow examples than to set new ones. The court said that genocide is a special kind of evil, but it didn't say that it violates the moral order of humanity. If it did, an international court would have to try the crime, and Israel wanted to try it itself. But since genocide has happened before and is becoming more possible in the future, it is important to set up an international court like this. Because the court didn't see what was special about crimes against humanity, it also didn't see how awful it was that Eichmann did these terrible things despite being terribly and terrifyingly normal. As a thoughtless bureaucrat, he may not have had the purpose to hurt, which is at the heart of most normal ideas of criminal behavior. However, this is just another reason to think in terms of a moral order, because Eichmann's actions, not his intentions, are what make him guilty. In the postscript to the second version, Arendt talks about how her book caused a huge stir among critics and the Jewish diaspora around the world. She insists that her focus is only on Eichmann, the single trial of a single man, and criticizes readers who try to make her idea of the banality of evil into a broad theory or explanation when it's really just a lesson, that such disconnection from reality and thoughtlessness can do more damage than all of man's evil instincts put together. She thinks that the judge's refusal to come up with a new way to deal with genocide and the public's unwillingness to assign moral blame to specific people are signs of the same moral erosion that let Nazi policies of extermination go on while the German people turned a blind eye.
About the author. Hannah Arendt was born in the Prussian city of Hanover to a well-known and politically active Jewish business family. She spent most of her childhood in Königsberg, which is now the Russian city of Kaliningrad. She studied philosophy at the University of Marburg, where she studied under Martin Heidegger and met Gunther Stern, whom she later married, the University of Freiburg, and the University of Heidelberg, where she got her PhD in 1929 with a paper on essay, Augustine's Idea of Love. Later that year, she moved to Berlin and married Stern, who wrote for a left-wing paper and soon ran away to Paris. But Arendt chose to stay in Berlin and get involved in Jewish politics. She worked for the Zionist Federation of Germany until the Gestapo arrested her for spreading anti-state propaganda and put her in jail for a short time. Realizing that she was also in danger, she ran away from Germany without any papers, joined Stern in Paris, and went to work for a Zionist group that helped Jews move to Israel. In 1936, Stern ran away again, this time to the United States, leaving Arendt behind. They soon got a divorce, and Arendt remarried the artist and philosopher Heinrich Blücher. In 1940, the Nazis started locking up Jews in France, and Arendt and Blücher were among them. They were held in different camps in the south of France, but they escaped, found each other, and got papers to move to New York, where they spent the rest of their lives. In the 1950s, her books The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1951, and The Human Condition, 1958, made her famous around the world. She also wrote for magazines and newspapers and taught at universities across the United States until she died of a heart attack at age 69. She is one of the 20th century's most influential political theorists, philosophers, and totalitarian scholars.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.